Welcome back to Dave Knows Comics for another How to Draw session. Today's episode is what's the difference between Professor X and Lex Luthor? Now, I'm a big believer that comic book characters, even though they're fictional, have distinct physical features. And I know not every artist keeps in line with these, and not every artist does things the same way, but as a whole, I think comic book characters over the years have developed certain facial patterns that we should acknowledge. And they're a great way to distinguish each other from different comic book characters that have similar features. And the biggest example I could think of is Lex Luthor and Professor X. Now, I'm going to draw both of them side by side and explain the difference the way I interpret it to how I distinguish the two from each other. And I think if we all can adhere towards this as a universal, I think it'll be much better to figure out when you just look at a bald guy, which character is it? Is it Lex Luthor or is it Professor X? So right here I'm going to start with the eyebrows. Now these high pointed eyebrows, some of you might already have figured, this is going to be Professor X. He has these high Vulcan eyebrows, especially in earlier comics. You might notice that he has these really, really thin, high, almost Vulcan-like eyebrows, as I said. And I always keep to that. I think they're very thin, very high pointed, and almost Submariner-like. I don't know if that was done initially on purpose to make him seem, a little beyond human or what, maybe more alien-like, but either way, I do remember them as being a very distinct feature, especially in earlier drawings. Not so much anymore, but it's something I like to keep in mind. And even if you don't go to the full-on extreme of it, it's something I think to do. Another thing of Professor X, I keep him with more, and this you could do, the crow's feet you could do too if you want, because Professor X does change his age. Sometimes he's like in his 50s, that's where I like to keep him. Although, because he's friends with Magneto, and Magneto is a World War II survivor, Professor X's age can go up too, along with him. Also here, the nose. I make it a very thin nose, down-pointing nose. That's the way I like him. Thin mouth. And also with the eyes, I also tend to make his eyes a little more narrower, a little more gaunt, as I'm going to do here with, I think, the big distinguishing feature for Professor X over Lex Luthor is the gauntness of his face. The whole thing is very narrow. I keep Professor X with a very narrow, very slim, tapered down, this gaunt cheek line. This is the way I draw Professor X. I think this is how I imagine him looking. Now, of course, some of this is reminiscent of the 90s animated series, which a lot of people who are familiar with them are. And so this is, somewhat based off of that design now. And this is how I do. And maybe, just maybe, his ears stick out just slightly. But that's how I draw Professor X. This is the overall general way I draw Professor X. And now when it comes to Lex Luthor, in contrast, here's the eyebrows. Thicker, not as pronounced, not as high rising. They're thicker. They're a little lower. This also creates a more menacing, cerebral look, a cooler look. I think Lex should be a very cool-looking character, very reserved, very chill, very bold. And that's the major difference. I also think their look should reflect their character. So when I draw Lex Luthor, he's a bolder character, so he's going to have bolder features. He's going to be very, his head's even going to be a little bit wider. I tend to make him this way. Now his eyes, I make his eyes a little bit bigger, his pupils a little bit bigger. His eyes aren't as beady as Professor X's. I make them more stamped. And I also tend to move the pupils higher up in the eye. Make him look a little more menacing, like his head's tilted down slightly. Make him look like he's looking through you a little bit more. Nose, as you can notice, it's a little wider. It's a little broader. It's a little more stout. It's a more substantial nose than Professor X's, and it's a little shorter too. Again, because everything about Lex is a little more bold. Now, and I give him a little smirk because even though he's the villain, I like to give him the smirk because it always seems like he's smiling about something messed up. And chin, I'm going to make him have a wider chin. Now, the weird thing for me is when I draw Lex, I kind of keep him. Now, this is a personal choice, and it also depends on the era of Lex Luthor you're drawing. But for me, I always keep him as a more in shape kind of guy, younger, playing. While Professor X is 50, or as I said, even older. I like to keep him at around 35, 40. And I also want to keep him as well. He's not as strong as Superman because he's not a Kryptonian. I like to keep him more physically in shape. So he looks like, at least appearance-wise, he looks like, a stable individual who could be on, Clark Kent's level if they were normal people both fighting each other. So, I think it works. And maybe these little sidelines for Temple as well. So as you can see, They're both bold characters, but yet there's a huge amount of difference here. And I think if you just look at it, you can figure out if I asked you which one was Professor X and which one's Lex Luthor, you would be able to tell. And here's the distinguishing lines. And I think without having to be told, you can kind of figure out which one's which. So there's just a little experiment. Try to think about characters that look similar for you and how you would distinguish them and what features you think are best. Thank you so much for watching. And as always, Dave knows.